Welcome to the Self-Publishing School podcast. This is the podcast to listen to if you're an aspiring writer or an author who wants to be more successful. On this show, you'll learn how to write and launch a book successfully, all from the top authors and people just like you who are doing it at the highest level. I'm your host, Chandler Bolt, the founder of Self-Publishing School, the author of the book called Published, and the CEO of selfpublishing.com. For free training on how to publish a book that sells 10,000 copies, go to selfpublishing.com/free training. Hey everybody, Chandler Bolt here, and joining me today is Jeff Goins. Jeff is an author, blogger, and speaker, and after working for 7 years in the nonprofit world as a marketing and communication director, he now writes and speaks full-time. Through his blog, online courses, live events, he challenges people to make their messages matter and helps them connect with their audiences. He's also the author of 4 books, including his most recent book, The Art of Work, which I'm sure we'll dive into a little bit in this interview. But really what we're going to be focusing on here today is the writing side of things and how Jeff has kind of really exploded things with his writing, also built his tribe, and is coming off the heels of one of his most successful book launches ever, I think, as far as I know. I'm sure we'll dive into that. So Jeff, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Chandler. Good to be here.
Awesome. Well, before we get into kind of the writing, we'll get into some mechanics here, kind of how you do things as well. Before we get into all that, I kind of want to take it back a little bit to start into how did all this get started? Because as I mentioned a second ago, you're working for several years in the nonprofit area. Like, how did you transition over from that? How did you get started, number one? And then how did you transition to going full time?
Yeah, so I got started realizing that what I felt like I was meant to do was not be a marketing director. As good at my job as I was at that, I just felt like at 27, 28 years old that I was succeeding at the wrong thing. And I was worried about where that would take me in 10 years. And I didn't hate my job. I wasn't stuck in some cubicle or anything, but I just felt like this isn't it. You know, I had an itch that I was trying to scratch. And through a series of conversations and realizing my wife had been telling me this for years, I realized I was a writer. Like, that's what I should be doing. And so I had a conversation around that time with a friend of mine, and he asked me what my dream was. And I said, I don't know. And I was kind of afraid to admit it. And he said, really, I would have thought that your dream was to be a writer. Like, he could see that just, knowing me. And I think that's often the case. I think that people closest to you can see the things that we tend to want to ignore sometimes. And I said, yeah, I guess you're right. I'd like to be a writer. And he said, Jeff, you don't have to want to be a writer. You are a writer. You just need to write. And the next day, I remember getting up at 5 a.m. and pulled up my laptop and I said, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to write. And I'd been writing kind of in fits and starts for the past several years, but I hadn't really done it with any dedication or passion. And that next year, I wrote every single day. I started publishing on a blog every day for a year without fail. And that kind of catapulted me into all these opportunities that I never anticipated. The blog grew. I ended up getting a book contract and saw some opportunities as the blog audience grew to start a business. And all these things really came out of 2 things, I think. One, just admitting that I was a writer, becoming this person that I wanted to be, and then doing the daily practice and sharing it with a small audience that grew over time.
And what changed once he told you, hey, you're a writer, man. You need to be writing. What changed in your mind to where going for a year straight? Because that's a big difference from going fits and tantrums kind of in writing to full-fledged writing every day for a year.
Yeah, I think it was, I thought of myself as a writer after that, and so what do writers do? Well, they write every day. And I didn't know much beyond that, but I thought, I don't have to be a good writer. I don't have to be an author. Like, I don't have to, be published, but I can be a writer. Like, a writer is just someone who writes. There was no official title that I was waiting to receive. Once I started thinking like that, when I started thinking really like a pro, I started to act like one. And so I think what changed for me is I thought, I can't keep playing this amateur game. I've got to commit and try this out with serious dedication for a while. And once I started writing, I thought, gonna start a blog. I've done this before. I've started a blog, had some idea in the shower, rushed out and, bought the domain, and then nothing, happens, and I kind of flake out on it. And I was like, I'll do this for 2 years. Like, I'll commit to this for 2 years. And if I don't see any fruit, if I don't see anything happen, and my goal was, if I could get 250 subscribers in 2 years, it'll be worth it. And, tens of thousands and eventually hundreds of thousands of people later, it was far more successful than I ever could have imagined. But I started really small, and the goal wasn't some phenomenal success. The goal was, this is who I am. Therefore, this is what I need to do. And I think that activity follows identity, that before you can go do something that you want to go accomplish, some big goal, you have to change something about your mindset, about who you really believe you are, so that you can go do that thing. If you think of yourself as an amateur, or like you're faking it till you make it, or a wannabe, you're going to act like that. You're not going to bring your best work. And I think you need to do what Stephen Pressfield calls turning pro. And you do that first in your head, and then you start doing it on paper, on your laptop, in front of other people.
So once you turned pro in your head, and you said you started writing every day for a year, because now you're a professional writer, right? What were the first things that you wrote?
So I was practicing in public. So, I started my blog, goinswriter.com, and you can go back to the very first post of, 800 posts now, I think. And you can find the first stupid thing I wrote, and the second stupid thing I wrote, and the third not so stupid thing I wrote, and the fourth okay thing I wrote. And you see this, hopefully you see this progression of quality over time. But it wasn't much. And in fact, I'm sort of known as a writer who coaches other writers and creatives. And I didn't start out with that goal. I just started out, I'm going to write and I'm going to share what I want to talk about. So I wrote about marketing, because that's what I've been doing for years. I wrote about business and leadership and these kind of like personal development ideas that I had for years and years. And I'm the eldest of 4 kids. And so I've been telling people what to do for most of my life. Now I was finally going to do it in a way that hopefully somebody listened. And most of it was stories with some sort of lesson. And 4 years later now, that's basically what I'm doing today, just hopefully a little bit better.
And now, how did you go from writing those blog posts to doing your first book? What did that look like?
So in 2010, I had this idea about starting a blog, and I had this domain that I was basically using as a writing portfolio site. At the end of 2010, I had this revelation that I was a writer and I needed to start writing. In 2011, I rebooted my blog, had a friend design a header for me for free, and I was like gonna get professional about branding and all of that stuff. And then I started writing on it in 2011. By the end of that year, I had a book contract, which wasn't much money. I didn't have some big, huge, book advance or anything, but somebody wanted to pay me to write a book. And I was like, this is awesome. And then in 2012, I ended up writing and publishing 2 books, one self-published, one traditionally published. The traditionally published book was supposed to come out in August of 2012. But in between when I signed the contract for that book in 2011 and then it coming out in 2012, we had a baby and our life changed. And one of the things that changed was that my wife wanted to stay home and raise our son, and we could not afford for her to do that. And so I tried to figure out, how can I replace her income? And I heard everybody talking about ebooks, and this was like the gold rush of the internet in 2012. And I had this friend who had made like $40,000 off an ebook in 2 months. So I called her up and I was like, how do you do that? She told me how she did it. And so I wrote a book in like a month. This is before the traditionally published book came out. So I turned in my first book, Wrecked. And while that's being edited, I'm like, I got to make some money. And so I went and I wrote this ebook called You're a Writer, which is just about this experience that I'm telling you, how I became a writer, how I started a blog, how I overcame all these mental blocks. And then that book came out before the traditional book. And that book replaced my wife's income, ended up replacing my income. We launched a course connected with that. We ended up like doubling and then tripling our income all in that year. So that by the end of 2012, I was making plans to quit my job and my wife was staying home and we were moving in the direction of our dreams. It was crazy.
Now, so you said you wrote the first book in a month, and then that was the traditionally published one?
The first book took like 4 months. It was a longer book, and I wrote that. I signed the contract in August of 2011. I started writing that. And by January-ish, it was done being edited. And so March came around and our son was due in June. I was like, all right, gotta make some money. And that's when I started the ebook, just really as a means of trying to make some side income. And that blew up in some big unexpected ways. And that plus the launch of the traditional book. I wouldn't recommend writing 2 books in a year, typically. Depends what you do, I guess. But it ended up working really well. And it was out of just this financial necessity. But the second book, You're a Writer, got the idea in March, started writing it in April, and it came out in May. And by the end of the year, we had made $50,000 off of the book and another $100,000 off of the course and other things that we had kind of created around the book. It was crazy.
Wow. Nothing like having a kid to kick your butt in gear, huh?
Yeah, I have said before that I would not be an entrepreneur if it weren't for my son, and that's absolutely right.
Wow, what a great, I'm sure as he gets older as well, that'll sink in a little bit more. And that's such a great gift to be able to give to him, right?
Yeah, except when he like wants a car or something. He's like, Dad, now really this money's my money because I made this happen.
Remember, Dad, you wouldn't be an entrepreneur if it wasn't for me. I saw that interview. I heard you say it.
Chandler Bolt says.
Oh man. Well, let's dive into what that the writing process looked for the traditionally published book, and then we'll get into the other book, and then we'll kind of draw some differences. But let's start for that first book. And what did that process look like? Because you're going from blog posts to now writing your first book.
Yeah. There's different ways to look at this. I do think that blog writing is different from book writing. This idea, I think a blog is a great way to practice, but this idea that you can just take a bunch of blog posts and turn it into a book, I don't think it works. I have a friend who's doing that right now, and he did it well, but it took months and months of editing to kind of create the arc that a book has. If you think about a blog post, typically the structure of a well-written blog post is you've got some headline, then something to grab their attention, a lead paragraph, a startling quote or statistic or question that grabs people, pulls them into the article. Then you transition into the body. You've got main points or a story that progresses in some sort of logical or narrative order. And then you wrap it up with a call to action, sometimes a question, and it's done. Like there's an arc to it, right? There's an emotional experience that you have. If you do that in a book, every 500 words or every 1,000 words, it's just up and down, up and down, up and down. A book has a much more gradual kind of projection, necessarily so. And I think that when you're writing a book, you got to think, okay, who am I, or what is the situation at the beginning of the book, and then what is it at the end of the book? And if you're writing a fiction book, you've got some problem, and then you work through that problem, and then you overcome that problem, and it either ends in success or failure, but there's resolution to the conflict. In nonfiction, it's the same sort of thing. You've got some problem that the reader has that either you personally had or you've got some sort of expertise. You want to solve that problem. Then you're going to lead them through this process like you would in a blog post, but it's much more gradual, that ultimately leads to hopefully success, overcoming this problem. And when you're writing a book, that's what you're thinking about. I think the main thing you need to be thinking about is not just what is this about. I think when somebody says, what's your book about? That's not what they're really asking. They're saying, why should I read this book? What's in it for me? And in a nonfiction book, in fiction is this way too, but it's a little bit different. In a nonfiction book, you're really wanting to solve a problem. Like, what is the problem that your book solves? It can be an implicit problem, like I'm going to help people have more confidence in themselves, something internal, or it can be an explicit or external problem, like I'm going to help you make more money. And it can be, both of those, but there needs to be some central problem that you're going to help the reader attack, and then you're going to lead them through that progression. And then you just break that down into chapters. Like each chapter needs to be a part or a piece or a step of that problem. I have a friend who writes lots and lots of nonfiction books, and he says every chapter needs to answer another question. You've got one big question, like how do I make money online? And then you've got 10 little questions that each represent a different chapter. Okay, well, how do you make money online? Well, you start a blog, you start a website, and you build an email list, and then you find out what people want, and you create a product. Well, those are steps, right? Within each of those steps, there's questions. Well, I need a website. How do I build a website? I need an email list. How do I build an email list? How do I find out what people want? How do I sell it to them? How do I keep making money? So you can see, once you have some big central problem that you solve, some big question that you answer, it can elicit all of these other questions. And I don't know that I didn't know any of this going into writing my first book. You sort of have to learn it by doing it. But going in with some structure, I think is really, really useful. And once I'd done that once with the traditional book, I could do it a lot faster with the self-published book.
So did you go in with any sort of structure on that first book?
Yeah, I mean, working with a traditional publisher, I think is beneficial in that they sort of force you to adhere to their structure in some ways, and they give you a lot of leeway, more than I ever expected. But they told me two things that I thought was useful. First, typically when you get a book contract, you've got to submit a proposal, and a proposal is the book outline. It's what you want to say. You're going to say, here's what I want to say. Here's why this book is different from other books. Here are other books that are like it. And if you go, oh, there's nothing like my book, the publisher doesn't want to hear that, because that means that there's no category for it. There's no place to put it on the shelf. People want to say, your book is like so-and-so's, but it's different in this way, right? And if they can't put it in a category, it's irrelevant to them. So you want to write a book that has companions, it has friends on the bookshelf. There are other books like it. But then you want to say something unique in that niche, in that genre. And then, you talk about who will read it and then what you're actually going to say. In chapter 1, I'm going to say something like this. And a lot of it's just sort of making it up as you go, but it gives some structure for you to dive in. So the first thing that they did for me was they helped me come up with that structure. And for me, it was just, this was a book about how we find our purpose through acts of sacrifice, acts of self-sacrifice, selflessness. When you think of finding your purpose, you think about me. And the book was counterintuitive in that it was, no, you need to not think about you need to think about other people. And that's where you discover a meaningful life. And then each chapter was just sort of a different step or part of that process. And I would just say, in this chapter, I'm going to talk about this part of it. And I'd worked in the nonprofit sector for years and, really I felt like I had a sense of seeing people constantly sacrificing themselves for the good of other people. And I was learning some of the trends and themes, from watching that. The other thing that I learned, and this is really helpful, once you have that structure, my editor said this to me. I said, where do I begin? He said, write what most excites you. What are you most excited about saying about this topic right now? Write that first. Don't wait till the end to do that. Like, don't start at the beginning of the book. If the thing that you're most excited about is chapter 4, start with chapter 4, start in the middle, and you'll kind of fill in the parts that you're less excited about. But start where the energy is. And I think that's a great idea.
Hey, Chandler Bolt here. I hope you're loving this episode so far. It's time to go from inspiration to implementation. All right, so if you've learned something, we want to help you implement what you've learned with your book. So what I want you to do right now is go to selfpublishing.com/schedule, book a publishing consultation with one of the experts on my team. We'll talk about your goals for your book, your dreams, your challenges, your next steps, and we'll start putting together a plan. All right, so go to selfpublishing.com/schedule, book a call with the team. Let's see how we can help with your book. It's time to implement. I want to take just a step back here because as you were talking about that, I was curious because I realized we didn't even touch on this. How did you get the book deal in the first place? Like, right. What did that look like?
Yeah, so what it looked like was I basically grew this blog. I was posting on this blog for 6 months. The audience was not growing that quickly. I had about 70 email subscribers on a list after 6 months of doing it, blogging daily. And I was like, this isn't going. I think by 2 years, I'll have my 250 people, but I wanted to see something happen faster. And I'd heard a ton about email lists and ebooks. And I was like, oh, no, like that doesn't work. And I was like, okay, I'll try it. I'll write an ebook. And I'll release it. And I used an old blog post called "Writers Don't Write to Get Read" or something, and "Writers Don't Write to Get Published." And it was about the writing for the love of writing, which is really what I'm about. And I think you can do that and still be practical. So I wrote this thing called the Writer's Manifesto, which was 900 words. It wasn't even an ebook. It was an article in PDF form. And I said, hey, if you join my email list, you will you'll get this free book. And I shared it, on Twitter, on Facebook. I didn't have any huge networks, several hundred people following me on Twitter, several hundred friends on Facebook. But I went out to several people that I had started to connect with, and intentionally reached out to some influencers that I had started to get to know. And one of those people was Michael Hyatt, whom I had befriended in the past year, and we live in the same town, and we got together for coffee a couple of times. He didn't know me really well, but I'd never asked him for anything. And I had gone out of my way to try to show him, hey, here's what I learned from you. And here's what your blog has meant to me and your message has meant to me. And not with any intent of asking him for anything, but just realizing this is how relationships start. They don't start with me asking you to do a bunch of favors for me. So, I had basically known him for 7 months. I hadn't asked him for anything. So I sent him an email and I said, hey, I wrote this thing. What do you think about it? And he said, oh, I love this. This is great. I said, well, would you mind endorsing it? Just writing because it's 900 words. You read it in like 5 minutes. And, and he wrote a nice little write-up of it, endorsing it. And then I launched that ebook, and he and a bunch of other people started talking about it. And my email list grew from 70 people to 1,000 in a week. And then once I had that lead magnet, once I had that ebook in place, 1,000 became 2,000, and then 5,000, and then, I don't know, probably close to 10,000 people. And then people started reaching out to me, literary agents and, smaller publishers. And I was at a conference in Chicago and met this acquisitions editor, the person who's in charge of bringing books into the publishing house. And we met and we talked. He goes, I'd love to publish you. And I said, I'd love to be published. So where do I sign? And I had a friend who was an agent. I didn't have an agent at the time. The publisher offered me a contract. Again, wasn't much money, but it was an opportunity to get published. And I just thought, man, I thought this would happen in like 10 years. And here it happened in 8 months. And so I had a friend who was an agent. I involved him in that. But really it came about as a result of getting an ebook out there, trying to be generous, do the things that, you hear so many people talking about online. And then meeting somebody at a conference kind of, by happenstance, and then, saying yes to an opportunity and figuring it out along the way. But without that email list, nobody would have cared. Nobody would have been watching me. And it was a great opportunity.
That's a great story. And let's talk about, so we kind of took a step back there.
Yeah.
I was a little curious, a little fun bunny trail. But so we talked about this first published book that you wrote, and now let's talk about the self-published book that you were writing when it was crunch time, right? Baby's coming. I got to get something else out and make some money. How did that process differ from the published book? Now that this is your second book, but it's different. It's self-published versus traditional.
Yeah, it's funny. I wrote it second, but it came out before the traditional book. So it's almost like my first book. It was the second book I wrote, the first book I published. I
have the exact same story. And it's so confusing to tell people first book I wrote was not the first.
Yeah, it's hopefully I'll just write a bunch of books and people will, stop asking me numbers because it's confusing. The process was different. I really thought about audience with this one. The first book I wrote, because I was expressing myself, and this is your first book and everybody wants to write a book. I wrote this book, You Are a Writer, because I wanted to sell it. And I still wrote it with passion, and I said things that were true. But I really thought about audience. I thought about how is this going to get marketed? How is this going to help people? And how can I position this as a book that people will want to buy? And it was a book about writing, so it's very different from sort of the, self-help book that I had just written. And I every day I sat down to write. It was shorter too. It was 20,000 words versus my, traditional book which was 40,000 words, both short books, but, significantly shorter. And it was all kind of practical. Hey, you want to be a writer? Call yourself a writer. Here's my story about how to do that. Hey, you want to get good? Start practicing. Here's my story about that. And here's other stories about that. And just every chapter were these short, practical steps in the process. And it was quick because it had to be. And it was very direct because I was trying to reach a specific audience and help them. And so sometimes I write books and I'm just sort of expressing an idea. There's still an argument. There's still a question or problem that I'm trying to solve, but it's a little bit more out there. This book was very focused. And I think, the following success was a result of that focus. You either knew that this was a book for you or it wasn't for you. You are a writer. No, I'm not. See you later. But people pick up that book and they go, yes, I am a writer. I want to be a writer. I'm going to read this book. And it immediately connected with the target audience, which taught me something about art and audience, how you can creatively express yourself, but also think about the person that you're trying to reach.
And by being specific, did that make writing that book easier?
Yeah, I think so. It wasn't hard. It wasn't a slog. Again, I had a deadline, which I think is the best way that I'm most creative. But I got down and I worked on it every single day, and I wrote it in about a month. And then I quickly formatted it and put it on Amazon and put it out there. And it was I don't remember struggling to write that book because I had just lived this for the past year and a half, starting this blog, getting a publishing contract, starting to get published in magazines, getting my work out there, growing an audience. And I had tried to do it the other way. I tried to do it where I didn't have a blog, I was like, I don't need a platform. And I was writing to that person that was, from 5 years ago, that was going, oh, I don't need any of that stuff. And I'm going, listen, little me, you need this. This is future me saying, you're going to want this earlier. And yeah, I just gone through it. I was living it. And I felt like I was basically writing that book for a younger version of myself, which incidentally, I think is not a bad strategy.
Now, is that book, the way you wrote that book, different than the other 3 that you've written?
I think every book you relearn how to write a book. At least that's been my experience with 4 books so far. I had a conversation with Guy Kawasaki, and I asked him this question. He's written probably a dozen books now, and I said he used to work with Steve Jobs, and he's the author of a lot of business books. And I said, every time I write a book, I feel like I'm sort of dying and like learning how to write all over again. I said, does that ever go away? I mean, did you experience this with your 10th book or whatever? And he goes, no, after like the 7th or 8th book, that goes away, and you just kind of figure it out. And I thought, oh, that's good to know. And this was like, at this point I'd written 2 books. I was like, I only have 5 more books to go. Great. And so it was sort of humbling, but I'm still, all that to say, every book I've learned something different. When I wrote my first book, I learned how to write a book. When I wrote the second book, I learned who to write a book for. When I wrote the third book, I learned how to tell stories, which it's always been important in my writing, but I had a book full of stories, and that book did not sell as well as some of the other books. But I'm glad I wrote that book because I learned how to tell stories by the end of it. And if I could go back and rewrite that book, I'd tell it way differently. So then with my last book, The Art of Work, I was able to weave all of these lessons together. How do I, now I know that now that I know how to structure a book, how do I say something to an audience that feels like a creative expression of myself, but also connects with them? And how do I do it in narrative form? Because I believe that can be transformative to people. And how can I bring all of these lessons that I've learned over the previous 3 books and combine them into, one great book? And that's what I try to do. And I felt like I was able to do that in terms of everything that I've learned up to this point, I kind of brought together in one book.
And do you feel like that book is your best work so far, or has been your best work because of that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, hopefully this isn't, a writer isn't guaranteed that every next book will be your best book. Some people peak early, some people peak late. But I hope that the books keep getting better and better. And I do think that this was a book that I will hopefully read years from now and still feel good about. Sometimes when you write a book, you immediately you'll publish it and then you'll go back and go, oh, man, I'm an idiot. Because by the time it's out there, it's 6 to 12 months after you've written it. And you've grown so much as a writer, you want to go back and rewrite the whole thing. When I finished The Art of Work and then it got printed and edited and I read it, I was like, this isn't so bad. Like a sentence here, a paragraph there, not so bad. I felt like I was able to enjoy my book, not as the person who created it, but as a reader. And I think that's what we're all trying to do, is create something that we would actually want to read, and we wouldn't just read it because we wrote it, And but I hope to keep growing. I mean, a lot of times I think people get stuck with how to start and they go, which book should I write first? I've got eight ideas for a book. Which one should I write first? And I always say, write your worst book first. Like, take your worst idea and write that first. I mean, do what excites you, but like, don't try to write 3 books at once. Try to write 1 book, at a time and get it done and go to the next one and write it as frequently as you can. But by and large, your first work is going to be your worst one because you haven't learned much. And every time you write a book, you're going to learn something. And I think writing a book is the best way to grow as a writer. Nothing stretches me like that. Blogging is great. Going to conferences is fine. Reading is great. But nothing forces me to grow as a writer as actually writing a book that I know people are going to read and I'm nervous, right? I have to take an idea and sort of kind of scope it out in some sort of comprehensive way. What's my argument? What's the story that I want to tell? And then be willing to commit to publishing it and hope that I don't get 1-star reviews because, then I'll feel terrible about, so that pressure makes me create something good and it forces me to grow in ways that I wouldn't grow otherwise.
That's a great point. And how long did it take you to write The Art of Work?
Well, I say really like a year. And I think now for me, it takes me about a year to write a good book. But what that looks like is I started the book in like December. I had an early version of it done maybe I started in like November. I had an early version done in March. And then I edited it like 6 more times. And like the last, version of it was done in like October, but that's lots of back and forth with the publisher, lots of edits and stuff. So I can write a book in 3 or 4 months and then spend another 3 to 6 months editing it, really saying what I want to say with it. And I know people who write way faster than that. They can write a book in a week, or, a month. And I've done that before. But if you're going to if you don't have the message in you and you've got to do some research, and The Art of Work was this really comprehensive book where I interviewed people and I read a bunch of books and I kind of assimilated my life story into it. And then I had to tell these stories well. It just took a lot of time. And I really enjoyed that process a lot. But it certainly took the longest to write. And I think the quality shows that. I mean, you see that I took sentences and I wrote them and rewrote them and rewrote them and rewrote them until they said what I wanted them to say.
You talked about writing on a deadline earlier and how that deadline drives you to do some of your best work. Did you have a deadline for Art of Work, and have you had a deadline for all of your books?
Always had a deadline, either self-imposed or others imposed. And it's usually better when it's not self-imposed because you sort of give yourself an out. So however you can create that accountability for you, I think is really important. But I've always had a deadline. I've met every single deadline except for The Art of Work. I pushed it back just a few weeks because I felt so strongly that there was something that was in the book that it just wasn't right. And I basically went back and rewrote the book, reworking all of the different chapters to kind of have the feel and flow that I wanted it to have. I didn't know at the time that authors are notoriously bad about keeping their deadlines, and they'll miss them by 6 months. So missing a deadline by a few days or a few weeks made me really nervous. In general, I'm a big fan of honoring your commitments, hitting those deadlines, and trying to stick to the schedule as much as you can, because within those constraints, really good creative work will emerge.
And what do you do to help hit those self-imposed deadlines?
I think there are really practical things that you can do, like carve out time every day to write. Don't just say, I'm going to get to it. Like, have a blocked out schedule of time where you're going to be focused on this, where you're not checking email, you're not watching Twitter, you're not answering the phone. For me, that tends to be early in the morning, not always. When it's late at night, it's so easy for me to just go, I'm going to go to bed, I'm going to do it tomorrow. And then, and then you wake up late, or, in my case, my toddler doesn't sleep through the night for some reason. Then I'm sleeping in and, dragging the whole day and drinking lots of coffee and forgetting about my book. And so when I'm working on a book, I intentionally block out, schedule time to write. And I've written 3 books while employed and only 1 book as a full-time writer. And so now I have a little bit more leeway with my schedule, but I'm also running a business. And so what surprised me being a full-time writer, when I finally became a writer, this was my full-time gig, was I still had to fight for time to write. It didn't just come. You will always have to block out that time because there's always going to be some distraction, something to fill your time, some demand on your schedule. And so for me, it means two things. One, it means setting the deadline, and then it means working backwards from that deadline and saying, how much time do I need to write every day, and how many words do I need to write every day to get to that deadline? I use Scrivener. I love that. If for no other reason, then you can say, this is when my manuscript is due, and it needs to be this long. It needs to be 50,000 words, and I've got 120 days. How much do I need to write every single day? And it'll tell you. And then if you fall, and then it'll calculate how many words you wrote today, and it'll tell you how many words you need to write tomorrow. I'll keep recalculating that like a GPS. I love it. I'm a big fan of that, for no other reason than you can set the deadline and then work backwards from it. But that's what it takes for me, is the deadline, the discipline of daily writing, and then some sort of daily target.
So you start your books with a word count goal in mind?
Yeah, typically. Mm-hmm. And then
how do you come up with that? Or good?
It depends on the type of book, the category of the book. So if I'm writing a business advice book, those books are 200 to 300 pages. I mean, the exceptions are the 400, 500, 600 word books typically, and then from there I go, okay, here's so typically with that genre of book, I'm going to write 50 to 65,000 words. And that just gives me some structure to say, okay, if I'm going to write 60,000 words and I've got 12 chapters, then the average chapter is probably going to be about 5,000 words. I need that kind of structure. If I just write, I just talk about whatever, I'll just keep going on and on and on. I need a frame for the art so that even if I want to kind of go outside the lines, I know that I'm going outside the lines. That isn't everybody's process, but that works really well for me. And every kind of book has a structure. A novella has a structure. A novel has a structure, depending on the subject, the length and breadth of what you're wanting to say. There's some idea of how long it's going to be. So typically, I think, how many pages is it going to be? 300 words, I think, are on a page ish. And then I just calculate it from there, and I go, this is a target that as I approach this, I can continue to sort of mess with. So The Art of Work was going to be a 50,000 word book. And then when I was finished, it was like a 65,000 word book. And then I think I cut it back to like 55,000 words or something. So typically you set a goal, you probably overshoot it if you're like me, and then you edit it down to more or less what it needs to be. And then maybe add a little bit extra when you want to, say everything that you want to say. But I think the best way to do it is to find a book that, you want to write a book like something that's already out there. You're not copying, you're not mimicking, none of that stuff. But it's not going to be like it's not like there's no book like this ever before. There's some book like it. You can still do innovative work, building on what other people have done. Pull a book off the shelf that you like or that you want to write like, and go, how many pages is this? And, multiply that by 300-ish. And that's your rough word count to at least get you started.
Got it. And do you keep writing blog posts while you're working on a book?
I do. And I think there's 3 ways to do this. I'm going to stop my blog and write my book for 6 months or whatever, and then go back to my blog. I think you lose a lot of momentum doing that. And then you're like, hey, I'm back, buy my book. And they're like, we haven't heard from you for 6 months. That doesn't always work on the promotional side. Then I've done the crazy thing where I write on the blog daily and then I'm writing in the book daily, and that feels crazy, as it should. And I think the happy medium is to write less on the blog, but to give your best work to your book, but to still keep writing on the blog. And if nothing else, you could say, here's an excerpt from my book that I've been writing, and here's what I'm learning, working on this book right now. I find that when I'm writing, the more work I'm doing, the more work I can do. The more stuff I can create. The more creative I am, the more creative I become, and I can just create more and more work. And the less creative I am, the less I'm creating, the less creative it makes me. And so it's not hard for me while I'm writing, 1,000 words a day for a book to, push out another 400 words for, a blog post talking about what I'm working on, because I've already got that momentum. The hardest part for me is to get started. But I do kind of step back from the blog a little bit. And when I can, I will write in batches. So I'll write, all the week's blog posts, on an afternoon, so that then I can spend the rest of the week focus on that book.
So you'll have like a blog afternoon or a blog day, and then the rest of the week spent on your book?
Yeah, when I'm planning it out well and not kind of scrambling to get it all organized. Yeah, and I'll write a few blog posts for the week, and then I'll do the daily writing in the book.
And when you're not writing a book, what does that blog writing schedule look like versus the other demands that you have, speaking, coaching, running the course, all that stuff?
I still try to batch stuff because I have more ideas than I know what to do with in a given day. And I try to carve out writing time. I write every day, but I don't write and publish on my blog anymore any day. I let ideas sort of sit and I sit on the ideas. I let them germinate for a while. But typically I'm publishing, something on the blog about 3 times a week. And I use what I call the 3 bucket system. 3 buckets are ideas, drafts, and edits. Ideas are, I'm walking around the neighborhood or whatever, and I go, oh, I got an idea, and I like write it down in Evernote on my phone, and then I'm constantly grabbing ideas, or wake up in the middle of the night and write the idea down. And then when it's time to write, usually in the morning, I'll sit down and I'll take one of those ideas out of the idea bucket, usually in Evernote, just an Evernote file, and then I'll draft it. I'll turn it into a 500-word piece that isn't polished. It's a rough draft. And then I'll kind of tuck that into a little drafts folder on my computer. And then in that drafts folder, I've got another draft, something that's kind of sat there that I've been thinking about, and I'll pull it out and I'll edit it and I'll finish it. And then I'll publish it, or I'll schedule it to publish, or I'll either send it to the blog or, save it for a book that I'm writing. I'll, send it to a magazine or something for an article. I'll find a home for it. And that's how I write every day, 3 different buckets. And if you fill each bucket, especially for coming up with content for a blog, you'll never run out of something to do. You can always sit down and you can edit a piece, you can draft something, you can kind of keep moving the system forward. And all you need to do that is you need to have 2 ideas in the bucket. So come up with 2 ideas right now, and then tomorrow you can pull one out, you can draft it, and then the next day you can go back, hopefully, and then put another idea in. And then you can take your draft and you can edit it, and then you can pull another idea out and draft it. And it just keeps going. When I started writing, the day that I wrote 2 blog posts in one day, and I created buffer for me, like where I had a little bit of room in between what I'd written and when I was going to publish something, that was like a magical day.
It's like a weight being lifted, right?
Yeah. All of a sudden there wasn't this pressure to come up with an idea, write it, edit it so that people actually want to read it, and then publish it all in the same day. I think that's not the way the writing process works. The writing process is different pieces. Most people think writing is all of this into one combined process. And I think it's those 3 different things: coming up with ideas, drafting them, and then editing them.
I love that 3-step process, and I think people will really love that as well. Any other productivity tips or writing tips in that vein, things that you use, things that are helpful?
I don't think so. I'm not a productivity guy, but I see the need for it. Like when I'm not being productive, I'm not producing, and I like making things, but I don't like systems and rules and plans. But one of the things that I've learned is that as messy as I am, and as messy as the creative process is, that when my life is cluttered, when it's filled with lots of distractions, or my desk is literally a mess, there's a certain point at which I can't create in that. It becomes restrictive. And so as messy as I am, I think that clutter is the enemy of creativity, or it certainly can be in my case. And so as much as you can fight for a clean workspace to focus on the work that you have to do, even if it means running out of the house and going to a coffee shop, or finding some space where there's room to create, I think is important. And that's, every once in a while I'll go, oh my gosh, this is a mess. I've got to just stop and bring some order to this, because creativity is a chaotic experience, but it is the process of pulling order out of chaos. It's not just making more chaos. It's really bringing order to things. Story, there's structure, ideas, there's structure. I mean, writing is the process of saying, this is the way this works. Even the most beautiful prose, you're taking something out of nothing, and there's inherent order to it. In order to do that well, I think you have to try to have order around you as much as you can. And I say that with the caveat, a lot of days my desk is a mess, but I don't think that helps my creativity any.
That's great. And Jeff, this has been great. And before we hop off, a couple things. One last thing I want to ask is, what would be your final parting tip for people thinking about writing that first book?
I think the thing that you need to think about before you think about writing a book is, how can I start writing every day? I think the distinction between professionals and amateurs, and I make that distinction not as you get paid to do it and you don't get paid to do it, but a mindset. I had an amateur mindset when I wasn't writing every day. The way to go from amateur to pro is to, first of all, acknowledge that you are a writer, and then secondly, to do what writers do. They write, and they write every single day. My challenge is to write 500 words a day for a month and see what happens. When I started doing that, I became a better, cleaner, more disciplined writer. And as I did that, I got more and more disciplined. I got more and more structured, and I'm not a structured guy, but it was like a muscle. And the more I worked it out, the stronger it became, and the more I was able to produce. And 500 words became 1,500 words. And, there's days when I wrote 5,000 words, but it all starts with, going into the gym and doing a few reps, going home, taking a shower, and then getting up tomorrow and then doing it again, doing it day after day after day. I can't remember who said it. Maybe it was John Acuff. He said that discipline begets discipline. I think that's absolutely true with writing. Before you can think about writing a book, you need to think about who you are as a writer, and then what do writers do? They write every day. If you start writing every day for as little as 500 words a day, I think that's like 30 minutes for most people. It won't be a question of when do I get to write my book, but really, when do I get to publish this book that I've already written? Because 500 words a day, several months in, you're going to have a book.
That's great. And then once you do that, you can be writing strong like Jeff Goins, right? Yeah. Awesome. Jeff, thanks so much. Before we part here, where's the best place where people can find out more information about you?
Best place to go is goinswriter.com. You'll get a opportunity to sign up for my email list. You'll get several free things, including a free ebook on how to build your audience, which is something that most authors and writers struggle with, and a whole bunch of other cool stuff. And that's like coins, but with a G, or as I was reminded in middle school, groins without the R. Goinswriter.com, and you'll find out more about that. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, brother. Talk to you soon.
Thank you, Chandler.
Thank you so much for watching or listening to this episode of the Self-Publishing School podcast. I know there's so many places that you can be spending your time. There's other podcasts that you could be listening to, YouTube channels that you could be watching. So thank you so much. It means the world. Now, I want you to do 3 things right now if you found this episode helpful. All right, number 1, I don't know if you know this, but we've got a YouTube channel. It's a companion channel to this podcast. All the video versions of the episode are on the YouTube channel. So number 1, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Number 2, if you're listening to this podcast wherever, whether this is Spotify, Apple Podcasts, number 2, I want you to subscribe to this podcast right now so you don't miss a future episode. And then number 3, this is probably the most important, leave a review on the podcast. All right, reviews are super important and help this podcast get discovered by other people. So number 3, leave a review on the podcast. Thank you so much. I'll see you in the next episode. If you're on the fence about scheduling a publishing consultation call with my team, maybe you're not quite ready for that, I've got some free training that I think will be really helpful for you. All right, all you have to do is go to register to sign up. Go to selfpublishing.com/free training. When you do, you're also going to get a free digital copy of my new book published. And on that training, you're going to learn the next steps of how to implement with your book. So how to write, how to publish, how to launch successfully. So go to register right now at selfpublishing.com/free training. I'll see you there.